A couple of years ago, writer Timothy Egan set out on a pilgrimage. It was a 1,200-mile journey from Canterbury to Rome, from England to Italy. It was an ancient path called the Via Francigena. And he writes about his pilgrimage in a new book that came out the last year called A Pilgrimage to Eternity. Why did he do this pilgrimage? What was his purpose for this 1,200-mile journey? Egan's pilgrimage wasn't just a physical one. He wasn't just there to see the sights and hear the sounds and go to old buildings. It was a spiritual journey too. Egan was raised an Irish Catholic, and he had a very devout mother. But as he grew, he became aware of the contradictions in his faith, in the churches he was a part of, and he became aware of the violent history of Christian faith. And yet there was some spark of goodness there that he couldn't let go of. There was something there, but that spark had been smothered by so many other things. Early on in the book, he explains the reason for his pilgrimage. He says, this paradox, how belief founded on a gospel of love could cause so much pain, is a big reason why people are leaving the church in droves. And it's no small part of my struggle as I step into this pilgrim realm. How many of us have had similar struggles with our own faith? How many of us have looked at the history of Christianity, or maybe the Christianity right in front of us, and wondered, is this it? How many of us have looked at the Inquisitions, the holy wars, the destruction and enslavement of people, and wondered the same things that Egan wonders as he sets out on his pilgrimage? How many of us have looked and have been disheartened when we see Christians consumed by the love of power or the love of money or exclusion of all kinds of good people and wondered, what good is Christianity really? I ask these questions myself, which is why I believe that my good friend recommended me Egan's book. He thought I would find some kindred spirit there. I know that we can't answer all of these questions that we have about our faith. We aren't able to give explanations for all of our troubled history, and we can't atone for our present sins with just a few words. And yet I do think we can pause. We can pause to meditate on a vision of the church that is simpler, that is kinder, that is more gracious. We can pause to meditate on a vision of the church in its infancy. This vision comes at the end of Acts chapter 2, which is the story of Pentecost. After Jesus' resurrection, he told his disciples to go home and wait. And so they waited, and then God's Spirit came and stirred them all up. And we read that thousands of people were added to their number, and people came to believe in Jesus and were baptized. And you might think that from there on, everything would just get bigger and bigger and greater and better, that the Spirit would do more huge things. And yet, at the end of Acts 2, that's not what happens. After this big thing happens, we read about a very small thing. A very small thing, which is just as miraculous as the big thing when the Spirit moved through. It ends with the story of the everyday life of Jesus' followers after Pentecost. We read about their daily life. And their daily life wasn't complicated. It wasn't big. It wasn't confusing. It was simple. It was accessible. And most importantly, in the few verses that we read, their life was good. We read how they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and prayers. What did the apostles teach? They probably taught the things that Jesus taught them. Jesus taught them to love one another. He taught them to give to everyone who asked. He taught them to turn the other cheek. I bet they talked about those things. Jesus also taught them about God's kingdom, how God's kingdom had come near us to bring the forgiveness of sins. It had come near the least of the world. I bet they talked about those things too. But most of all, I imagine how they talked about Jesus' death transformed their vision of life and how his resurrection gave them a new hope for the world. This is what they talked about. Then we read that they devoted themselves to the prayers. What did they pray? Well, they probably prayed the Psalms that they still prayed since they were a kid. They probably prayed the Lord's Prayer that Jesus taught them to pray, and many other prayers. These are very simple things, devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to prayer. But that wasn't all. They also lived what they learned. They devoted themselves to one another's well-being. They were constantly selling their possessions and giving to the poor. In fact, it says that they shared all their property in common. There was nobody in need among them. Now, this might sound radical and revolutionary to us, but here it seems like the most common thing in the world. Of course, this is how Jesus' followers would live. That's how Jesus lived, isn't it? God's kingdom had come. Jesus had died for our sins and been raised from the dead. And so what are a few worldly possessions? What is wealth in the face of this new good thing? And then finally we read that the disciples devoted themselves to the breaking of bread and fellowship. I think that the phrase breaking of bread wonderfully sums up the picture of this early Christian community. Because what's more common and down to earth than sharing a meal with someone? Everybody does that everywhere. We share a meal with the people that matter to us most. What's more simple? What's simpler than eating bread? But this simple act is one of the greatest reminders of Jesus. Jesus always broke bread with people. Everywhere he went, he broke bread with everyone. Everyone could eat at the table with Jesus. Tax collectors ate with Jesus. Sinners, prostitutes ate with Jesus. Even Jesus' enemies ate with him. The Pharisees and Sadducees, he ate with them too. Jesus shared a meal with everyone. Sometimes the meals that he shared were holy meals, like the Last Supper, but most of the time they were common meals, ordinary meals, everyday meals. And here with the early Christians, there doesn't seem to be a distinction between the holy meal of the Eucharist and the common meal of just breaking bread, because all their meals were where Jesus was there. And we read, they broke bread with glad and generous hearts, praising God and also having the goodwill of the people. People saw them and noticed they had the goodwill of the people. Doesn't this description of God's people sound good and refreshing? Here, the church is not consumed by power and wealth. Instead, they're sharing the wealth they have. Here, they aren't debating on how to run a church or keep a church going. Instead, they're doing the simplest things they can think of. They're listening to the words of the apostles, devoting themselves to prayer, and breaking bread, remembering that Jesus is right there with them. Now, for how wonderfully simple this image is, we know that it doesn't last. It doesn't even last in the book of Acts. Even through the book of Acts, we see that this community, it falls apart for different reasons. It falls apart because of persecution. It falls apart because of arguments. It falls apart for numerous different reasons. There are tensions and disagreements even among the apostles. And Jesus' followers, they don't always have the goodwill of the people. Sometimes the people want them out of town. And then there's the rest of our story after the book of Acts. Most people reading Acts say Luke paints a pretty idealistic picture of the church when the church has never quite looked exactly like that. And that's what most of us know too, that the church throughout its history has had its moments of grace, but also its moments of shame. It's had moments of peace, but also moments of violence. Sometimes God's people are those who refuse to kill and give up their lives. Other times God's people are building crosses and new torture devices. And yet still, even through all of this complicated history, there is still that spark. There is still that spark that we read in this small passage in Acts, a spark that shows a simpler, kinder, more generous faith. And this spark has continued and has not been diminished, even though our history has had all kinds of things cloud the spark. About 100 years after Jesus, there was a Christian philosopher named Aristides. And Aristides, he wrote a letter to a pagan king telling the king what these strange people called Christians were all about. And here's what Aristides wanted to tell the king. He didn't want to tell him that these were the greatest and smartest and strongest people. Here's what he told them. These Christians walk in humility and kindness, and falsehood is not found among them, and they love one another. And from the widows, they don't turn away their faces. And they rescue the orphan from him who does him violence. And he who has gives to him who doesn't have, without grudging. And when they see a stranger, they bring him into their own homes and rejoice over him as if he were a brother. And if there is among them a man who is poor and needy, and they don't have an abundance of necessities, they fast for 2 or 3 days, just so they can supply this needy one with food. And then throughout the history of the church, there are people like St. Benedict and St. Francis, in times when the church had become bloated with power and wealth, they sought to embody a simpler way of Jesus. John Wesley encouraged his followers to meet in small bands of people that reflected this image of Acts chapter 2, where they prayed together and met together and cared for each other. Dietrich Bonhoeffer created a small learning community during World War II in order to resist the influence of the Nazis and the German church that had become so corrupt. In all of these cases, these simple and generous communities, they were small. They weren't the main thing. They weren't the main thing in the Roman world. They weren't the main thing in the German world or in the Latin world. There were much larger forces at work, larger and yet not more pervasive. They couldn't do anything to diminish this spark. And this is something that in the end I hope and that I trust in. That in the end, this simpler vision of faith, this more generous and open-handed form of Christianity is more persistent. It's more persistent because it's a picture of who Jesus is. Because after all, Jesus was not the loudest or the mightiest or the wealthiest. He was a poor Jewish teacher who taught poor men and women the simple ways of God. And yet this same simple Jesus, we believe is God's Son, the one from whom all things were created, the one who holds all things in his hands, and the one who is even now renewing and remaking all things. Timothy Egan walked 1,200 miles of the Via Francigena in search of a vision of faith that was true to the spark that he felt. Now today, we don't have to leave our homes to find this simpler vision of faith, because many of us are faced with a simpler reality right now. As we've had to put our church gatherings on hold, we had to ask the question, why do we do what we do? What does it matter? And what will it mean when we come together again? This week, as our governor announced Indiana's stay-at-home orders will be lifted, it doesn't mean everything is going back together at once, but it does mean we're looking at meeting together again. We'll gradually start coming in together. But there is a temptation in all this, simply to return to normal. And for most of us, normal prior to all this was anything but simple. Our country that we live in was anything but gentle and generous. And yet right now we have a moment to recapture that spark, to remember that we do not really need very much to be God's people. We have the records of the apostles' teaching in our scriptures. We have the Psalms and the Lord's Prayer and many other prayers. We have neighbors we can share with. We have people under our own roof that we can be generous with. And most of all, we all have bread, even if it's gluten-free bread. And that bread that we break and we share reminds us that we have Christ, who is always with us when we break bread, whether that be Holy Communion or at our kitchen tables. And all these things we still have, even during quarantine, even during a pandemic. And how much more could we have these things when we start to meet again? God, let us break bread together and devote ourselves to the simple way of Jesus. Amen.